Welcome back to the Conservation Tribe. Today we are joined by Leif Cocks, a world-renowned orangutan expert with over 30 years experience working with orangutans. He's the founder and president of the Orangutan Project, the world's foremost orangutan conservation not-for-profit. He's an author, he's a speaker, and has also recently been awarded one of Australia's highest honours, the Medal of the Order of Australia, for services to species conservation. And that's just to name a couple of the achievements. So Leif, thank you for coming on the show.
Most welcome, Blaine. It's great to be here.
It's a bit of an understatement to say that your conservation resume is pretty bloody impressive. You've done a lot of amazing work throughout the years. And for someone like me who's just kind of starting at the beginning of my conservation journey, I'm pretty intrigued as to what your background story looked like. So can you please speak to that and explain how your conservation journey started, and perhaps expand on a couple of key events in your life that sparked this fascination with the natural world?
Mm-hmm. I think I always had an innate love of the natural world. And although I was brought up in probably the most overpopulated metropolis in the world, Hong Kong, I basically kept a menagerie in my room of various animals and bits of nature, I guess. But my main journey started when I was working with 15 orangutans and discovered that they're self-aware persons and didn't belong in captivity, and they only could survive and thrive in their own culture and communities in the wild. And of course, quickly discovered that they'd been driven to extinction. So that started my journey to save the orangutan, as well as obviously save the rainforests, save our planet, and many other things such as assisting all the other wildlife and the indigenous communities that share the forest.
So these are kind of some experiences that you've had that have generally sparked this fascination. But what are some specific moments that inspired you to start the Orangutan Project? And what is your mission and vision for the project?
Yeah. It's love and compassion, which is ultimately the foundation of the Orangutan Project and the other organizations that I run. Our vision for the orangutans is that one day all orangutans will live in the wild in viable populations in secure habitat. And our mission is to secure 5 to 8 viable ecosystems of the right type, shape, and size of forest that will allow the orangutan, the other wildlife, indigenous communities to get through this extinction crisis. And so we can pass on to future generations a recoverable environment, not only for wildlife, orangutans, and biodiversity, but for the future economy of our grandchildren. And so, unfortunately, we only got another about 10 years to do this. And I think that with the global crisis, with climate change, scientists are also saying, again, we've got 10 years to turn this around. And so that means no retirement, no rest. We've got 10 years to do enough that we can hand over to future generations at least a recoverable planet and recoverable ecosystems before it's too late.
Yeah, so that 10-year time frame that you're referring to, is that the general kind of climate emergency that we're all facing, or is this a time frame that's more specific to the orangutans?
It's both, and it's obviously linked why those two time frames are both relevant. At least, let's say for the orangutans, if we don't save these viable ecosystems, so you've got to have the right type, shape, and size of forest for ecosystems to survive. After that, there will be rainforest, but it will be unviable and eventually disappear. Yep. We may have orangutans, but they won't be in viable populations, in viable. So in other words, you'll have, areas and you still have orangutans, you still have forests, but those ecosystems and those populations will no longer be sustainable. So it eventually collapse. So similarly, in the global level, you're seeing the same thing. You say, okay, yeah, will there be a world in 10 years? Yes. But will it be recoverable? It may not be so, because we've gone too far. And we're seeing this kind of escalation. I mean, for example, the destruction of the rainforest causes more global warming in all the transport systems in the world combined, all the trains, planes, automobiles, cars and boats. And that is causing, obviously, global warming. And now what we're seeing global warming is happening is we're having major droughts in the forest, which is destroying the productivity. We're seeing major fires, which is further destroying the rainforest and other areas. And then we're also seeing the megafauna, such as the orangutans and other wildlife, disappearing because they can't find enough food. And they're the main seed dispersers for many species. And so the carbon stocks are the remaining less full forests is a lot less. Yeah, and so you see this spiral doesn't make sense. They all interact with each other to send us down, I guess, the funnel of extinction. And so it's a far more interactive process than most people realize.
Yeah, all these challenges aren't, I guess, challenges in isolation. They are all interlinked. And when you talk about climate change, that obviously has global implications. And, drought, for example, that then in turn affects orangutans and other people or other species. Sorry, I just refer to animals as people. I do that sometimes. Affects these species, and then that has a ripple-on effect. Yeah, so it's important for people to consider this and complex and interlinked challenge. These things aren't isolated problems. They are all interrelated.
Exactly. And in my book, Finding Our Humanity, I talk about how we have a tribal brain. So without spiritual evolution, to want for a better term, our brains are set on a tribal level. We care about our tribe, however we define that, our community, religion, political party, or whatnot. But however, because of our ability to make large changes over the globe, the solutions and our capacity to care about others need to expand beyond that. And so our intuition, doesn't make sense, is to fall back into, I guess, the politics that we see, party lines, one about the immediate future, what about our own tribe? However, that will destroy us. It worked for hundreds and thousands of years when we had low technology living on a tribal level. But that unfortunate inability to expand our consciousness beyond the tribal mind is a main challenge that we have to overcome.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. You can see the implications of that just by looking at the news and by going on social media. It seems to be there's a divide in a lot of these topics that we talk about, and it seems like from a general stance, it's like left versus right. And these conversations are approached like everyone's very tribal. And if they're on the tribe of the left or the tribe of the right, you go into this conversation not really to take on any better information. It's like it's me against you, essentially. And there is this clash and there is this divide, which isn't conducive to constructive conversation and change, to be frank.
No, exactly. And all communication is first about love and empathy. One is you listen to somebody, truly listen to them. And two is if you listen to somebody, does it make sense, and have empathy, they're more likely to listen to your ideas. And so this is one of the reasons that conservation was so ineffective, because people go into it trying to reform the world without reforming themselves. And therefore, they just get into us against them dialogue. Does it make sense? And in fact, and they actually end up destroying the work that we're trying to achieve. The tribal minds are really effective if you want to go into business and make short-term profit, because that's what it's made to do. You form a tribe in your company, you fight other people or other blokes in the other tribe, and you have a short-term 5-year plan and you achieve it. But it's very destructive outside of that tribal circle that you create. Where the conservation, that tribal mind destroys what we're trying to achieve, because what we're trying to achieve is a higher ideal, which includes bringing into the field of inclusiveness not only all other people, but all other persons, such as orangutans and elephants, and all other beings, such as animals. And unless we have the capacity to do that, we end up in the long run being very ineffective.
Yeah, and I think there are some benefits to being in a tribe, for example. I think the challenge is, or the problem arises when you are resistant to collaborate and work with other tribes or other people with differing points of view. So I don't think it's a matter of like, let's go from 100% tribal mentality to a zero. It's kind of finding that happy medium in between there somewhere, and just learning how to collaborate and work with other tribes, aka people with differing points of views and different cultures and all that kind of stuff.
I would say at one level we have to collectivize.
Yes.
As individuals, we've been sold this pup. Oh, we act as individuals. Go palm oil free or whatnot. We're going to achieve anything. Well, we're not really. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but we're not going to achieve anything. If you want a bit of money, you get a job. If you want a lot of money, you collectivize capital into a company. If you want a small pay rise, you may ask your boss. If you want really good working conditions and a pay rise, you collectivize into a union. Similarly with conservation, individuals are always ineffectual. We're successful as a species because we have the ability to collectivize into organizations. And so so the ability to collectivize is our main achievement. And so you talked about some of my achievements at the beginning of the podcast, but my main achievement is the ability to collectivize and work well with others. However, the vision doesn't make sense, and the empathy and love of the leader for that tribe to be effective has got to go beyond the tribe. Look at all the great men. If you look at Martin Luther King's speeches, he doesn't talk about black rights. He talks about the rights of all human beings. You look at Mahatma Gandhi, he doesn't talk about India being independent, against the English. And in fact, he's very sympathetic to the English and their plight, and stopped the independence movement during World War II because he thought it was not right to drive the independence movement when they were in a major conflict. He had compassion and love, doesn't make sense, which extended beyond his duties to his tribe, and that allowed him to make effective, meaningful change. And India, despite all its problems, is the largest effective democracy that we know today. And that can only be achieved, doesn't make sense, through love and compassion. And of course, obviously, his love and compassion for the Muslim people, where he literally said, "I'm going to starve myself to death unless you," doesn't make sense, "you stop persecuting and looking after the Muslim minority within India." And it's only that level, doesn't make sense, of leadership, if makes sense, of your tribe beyond the tribal mind, that I think we can be effective in this world.
Yeah, and I think having those conversations at that base level, that ground zero, these core foundational values that you personally live by, and also your community, your family, or your tribe, these are really important. And you mentioned compassion, love, kindness, empathy. That's where the conversation really needs to be around, because you think of those topics and you may not necessarily think automatically saving orangutans. But when you break it down, that will, if we as human beings can become more empathetic, more compassionate, more kind, more loving, conservation, protecting animals and ecosystems and all that kind of stuff is a byproduct of that change in mentality.
Yeah, I would couch it a slightly different way. Your outgoing expression is the expression of your internal world. So you could pretend to be a great person, great conservationist, compassionate person, but if you're unhappy inside, it will come out. If you're in pain, doesn't make things are suffering, you snap, you're ill temper, and you can't help it. You naturally will create misery in the world, no matter what your good intentions, because that you can hide it for a while, but your inner need for name, fame, money, power, doesn't make sense. Those toys to support your sense of lack of self-worth will come out. Alternatively, if you spend the time to find that love and joy, within yourself, you know what I mean? That will naturally have to express itself. So you can't help it. Does that make sense? So the true conservation is asking why they do it and how they keep going. The answer is they can't do anything else. Does that make sense? They have this love and compassion, and they have to express it. Does that make sense? In the most intelligent way they know, whether that's through orangutans, which then save the forest, save the indigenous communities, saves Indonesia's future economy, saves the planet from global warming. These are the natural expression of love through your particular talents and needs, and that has a universal effect.
Yeah.
Hate shrinks down. Does it make sense? Love, no matter how you express it, does it make sense? Will expand even beyond. Does it make sense? The mission of your organizations and the things that you create.
So to add to that, then it sounds to me as though you're saying that self-awareness is a pretty crucial component of this, because that's something that I very strongly believe in, is trying to develop some level of self-awareness. And that means having an understanding of what you're good at, what you're not good at, your passions, your interests, having this base understanding of who you are can then inform these other things that you're referring to. Like that seems to me to be maybe the almost the beginning is trying to learn who you are first, and then you can make an impact.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm saying is you should, to reform the world first, you have to reform yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not saying before you start on a journey to help others that you have to sit in the Himalayas for 20 years. However, you while you start on that journey, you've got to start reforming yourself.
Definitely.
And the other thing I would say is it may be difficult to find happiness within oneself, but it's impossible to find it outside of oneself. Does that make sense? If you can find that happiness and joy within yourself, does it make sense? You're then free.
Definitely.
You're no longer needing outside support for your happiness. Does it make sense? And therefore, you can make really good decisions. Does it make sense? Not clouded, doesn't make sense, by needs for short-term external gains.
And that short-term happiness is probably a trap. Like intrinsic happiness is what we should be seeking, but you can have the illusion of happiness in the short term coming from external factors, and that feels good in the moment, obviously, but is probably not a sustainable method to or it's not a sustainable system to follow if you're trying to be happy for the long term. Exactly. Like it needs to come from within.
Yeah. In the seed of every happy moment is despair. In every moment of despair, there's a seed of happiness. So if you're looking for external support, you're in this endless cycle. Does it make sense? Of happiness and despair. If you find the joy and love within yourself is constant. The lines from a poem that I often quote is, "In vain the endless seasons roll for the one who bears an eternal summer in his soul."
Mm-hmm.
So, people say, "Oh, you got an award. Don't you feel good?" "Oh, yeah, I feel good, but not a big deal." They're the problem. You're facing another great tragedy, saving orangutan, another setback. You must be devastated. "Oh, look, it's bad, but I can get through it." The reason being, doesn't make sense. That gives you the fortitude to go on, because so many conservationists or people who are trying to they burn out. They become drunks. They become embittered. They have to retire. Does it make sense? And conservation, and that's is what I call a marathon with hurdles. We can only achieve things, doesn't make sense, if we can just stick at it for years and years and years to achieve the aim.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to create within ourselves the environment which allows that to happen.
So true. So true. I'm all about that. Approaching conservation from a marathon versus a sprint makes a lot of sense to
Mm-hmm.
me. But the challenge is conditioning your body and your mind to be able to run that marathon, because
Mm-hmm.
even in the physical world, that takes a lot of training. So
Mm-hmm.
the same would apply to I guess conservation if you're approaching it from a marathon perspective. I like how this conversation has gone very philosophical. this is where my brain naturally goes. So I'm glad you're on the same wavelength. But we'll revert back to some orangutan related stuff now.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned in your book, Orangutans, My Cousins, My Friends, that you think of the Orangutan Project like being a holistic doctor that seeks to address the root of the problem. So with
Mm-hmm.
respect to orangutan conservation, what do you believe is the root of the problem? And what are some examples and symptoms that manifest from that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because the issue is often, people will come in with a very simplistic viewpoint, and it's often based on their own skills and interests. They might say the key to conservation is education, and just do education. Or the key, if you're an action man, you go, the key to conservation is wildlife rangers in the field patrolling, or or the key to conservation is government deals. If you're kind of a bureaucrat, and so it's it's like going to your doctor with a different ailment, and he gives you the same prescription, the same dosage every time. You realize he's a quack. And so what you have to do is you look at each ecosystem that we're trying to save, and we diagnose the disease, and we prescribe the prescription in the right dosage and the right type of medicine to achieve that. So it could be ranges, it could be changing land use data, it could be community development, it could be education, it could be replanting. There's a whole variety of things that need to go into it, and so again, it's about always realizing. Unfortunately, it's bad for marketing. Simplistic solutions to a complex world don't really achieve anything, And of course, politicians want to give you a simplistic answer because it goes to our tribal brain. We just want simplistic answer. This is going to solve our problem. But of course, they're always selling you a pup. It's always not true. And so you have to go beyond that and to make sense and see the complexity of the world, and apply the solutions in a multifaceted way. So so that's basically our strategy. Let analyze properly the problem. Does that make sense? And prescribe the conservation, rather than what happens is people will become part of an organization, and they'll say support my organization, not the guy down the road doing that ecosystem, because we're better and we're wonderful and he's not a good person. Again, it's destructive. Or they'll say, look, we're into education, and education is the most important thing, so you've got to give to us, don't give it to the guy who's funding rangers, because this is the way to achieve it. Rangers are not really the solution. Doesn't make sense? And that's where you get this kind of division and increased ineffectiveness of conservation by not understanding the big picture, and also for organizations not working together. And so what we would do, for example, if we look in the ecosystem we're trying to save, we don't go in and say, well, we're doing this because we think that's really cool, and that's what we think is important. We go, okay, this is the ecosystem. Who are the players we can use their current skills and infrastructure and knowledge to work with and achieve the aim? Does that make sense? And so we work together in a holistic way. So you don't double up and start, replicating things or competing things. And that makes the conservation very effective and very cost effective in a way to achieve the aim. Because ultimately, for example, with the Orangutan Project as an example, my ultimate vision for the Orangutan Project, if I had, the best day of my life, after my life mission, would be if I could just close the Orangutan Project, because, hey, it's not needed anymore. We've achieved, does it make sense, the objective. All the orangutans live in secure habitat and viable populations in the wild. Yeah. And so, does it make sense?
Yeah.
Although
yeah.
obviously 90% of my job is, just keeping the Orangutan Project going and effecting the change. But ultimately, it doesn't make sense. It needs to go because the world I want to create, does it make sense?
Yes.
Goes beyond that.
Yeah, I heard you say that in a YouTube video, and it's a great way to look at it because it's ironic in a lot of ways. The objective, the ultimate goal for your project is to close the project or reach to a point where your project is no longer needed or relevant.
Exactly.
It's kind of like a full circle, like birth and death of the project is the goal.
Yeah. And we see this, for example, let's say in politics, they will put the party's interest before the country's interest. It's a tribal mind, doesn't make sense. And they put their own interest before the party's interest. You see that every politician seems to be like that. So similarly, I put the Orangutan Project's interest before my own personal interest. Yeah. But also, I put the interest of conservation, does it make sense? And the welfare of the animals before the interest of the Orangutan Project. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. You, as we discussed earlier, you get into this destructive cycle. Yeah, not only that, you don't achieve the outcomes you want. So almost to achieve your outcomes, you have to go beyond it. Yeah,
definitely,
in order to be effective.
Yeah, and I like how the thing you mentioned before about it's not appealing marketing wise to market a simple problem or a simple solution, but that's quite dangerous because obviously conservation is intrinsically complex, and it's dangerous to try and deduce a complex thing to simple things because that's just not what it is. But the other add-on to that is from simple beginnings, complexity can arise from that. So they're talking about the empathy and the kindness, love. These are pretty simple concepts. But if we practice that at a global scale, there's so much complexity, beautiful complexity that can come from that. So yeah, simplicity can evolve into complexity. And you just look at evolution, like that's obviously an example of that. From a conservation strategy point of view, what are the key areas that the Orangutan Project cover to address some of the threats facing orangutans and their habitat?
Yeah, as mentioned before, it's these key ecosystems that we're trying to save before it's too late. And to do that, we have ranges that we fund to go in. We have community development. We have community education. We change the land use status of the land from unprotected to protected. And even, for example, one of the areas, we feed the children and we fund their schooling because we have to work with Indigenous communities. And our in doesn't make sense, for the first understanding that we're on the same page is we can both agree we love their children. Does that make sense? And when the children are fed, it doesn't make sense, and educated, doesn't make sense. Yeah. Then we have a level of empathy and connection that then we can discuss how we're going to manage this ecosystem for mutual benefit of the wildlife and themselves. And the great thing is, these are all win-win solutions. It doesn't have to be wildlife versus the environment or the economy, versus ecosystems. That in the long term, the win-win solution is to preserve these intact ecosystems, for everybody. So the only thing we can't give a win-win to are the big multinationals, does that make sense, who are looking to have income, long-term sustainable income reduced to a 5-year business plan. And they want to have income which goes to the majority and all the people in the communities reduced and taken off overseas. Yeah. And that short-term greed, does that make sense?
Yes.
That what we can't help them with, because that kind of thinking is destroying the planet. But for everybody, we can certainly make a greater planet. But also we have to be mindful, and it's no conflict here, because people think, oh, do you save the animals, save the environment? But it's both the same job in the conflict. We have to recognize that orangutans are self-aware persons, the most intelligent person on the planet next to human beings. And each individual is worthy of love and compassion, and to be saved, an opportunity to live wild and free in its own society. And so we do a lot of work, supporting the rescue, rehabilitation, and the release of orangutans. And more and more, as the population declines, each individual is so important genetically for the survival of their species. So you have to care, does it make sense? So about the individual. So, I mean, all things. So, for example, if you have a society where, the individual is taken too much, doesn't make sense. So maybe I'll put it this way: good government is about balancing the rights of the individuals versus the rights of society. If you go too much to the rights of individuals, you get fascism. You get a few individuals benefiting and exploiting the others. If you go too far the other way, and where you say society only matters and individual doesn't, you get communism. And that suppresses and destroys people. So good government balances those two things: the rights of the individual and the rights of society. And good conservation is the same. You can't go too far the other way, because you have some conservationists say, don't worry about saving orangutans and the individual elephants. It's all about the trees, and they've got it wrong. And you've got some conservationists to say, look, it's all about saving that baby orangutan. I don't want to know about global warming, saying for us. Again, they've got it wrong. It's a balance of those two things which allow maximum effect.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And the thing that you're talking about with win-win, win for the animals or the ecosystem and win for the local communities. One thing that I'm quite interested in is, a lot of the threats that are coming around through deforestation are occurring because of these businesses, these large-scale businesses. And so I'd like to see in the future a win. I think there's a possibility to do business in a way that's good for the environment, good for people, and good for profit. Like, there is a way to harmonize those three things into one is beneficial for pretty much everyone involved. That's not the model that we're seeing at the moment. We are seeing it's trending, it seems like, for smaller scale businesses that are more conscious about the environment, which is great. But yeah, one day I'd love to see that reach kind of at a global large scale, because when we get to that point, I feel like that's when a lot of progress will be made. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. It's not about creating an impoverished world to save the environment. It's far from it. You're going to create a highly profitable world. You need a sound, safe environment in order to do good business, and have people in affluence. And you see a lot of companies that, divesting, for example, from fossil fuels, investing in renewables, and seeing the job opportunities, seeing the profits. Does that make sense? And what they call it is the fifth industrial revolution. And so it's a bit like these old dinosaurs from the third industrial revolution. We have investment in the old fossil fuels. Does it make sense? They're paying off our politicians in order to keep the status quo, so they don't lose all the money from their investments. But just like this is a free market. If you're stupid enough to invest in the old technology, when we're going through an industrial revolution, you're going to have to probably lose. The smart ones, are already investing into this current industrial revolution, and they're going to be profitable. They're going to be the people employing people in the future and driving our economies. However, our politicians all around the world seems to be, in the pockets, doesn't make sense, of a few dinosaurs, who are too stupid to find their way to the nearest tar pit, pun intended. We're destroying our planet for it.
Yeah, but those dinosaurs have a lot of cash, and money talks in those situations. One thing I'm interested in is palm oil. Palm oil is a very topical is very topical at the moment. And according to the IUCN, there are 193 threatened species that have palm oil listed as one of their main threats. If we want to mitigate that threat, do you think we should boycott palm oil completely? Is it a matter of kind of going towards more sustainable palm oil, or is the solution just far more complex and nuanced than that?
It's the latter, far more complex. In fact, if you drive the best palm oil campaign and go sustainable palm oil, whatever that means, because palm oil is a monoculture, and therefore science just tells us it's unsustainable, and we know they'll all collapse in 50, 60 years' time and leave a wasteland of environment and economy for those countries. So let's not worry about sustainable palm oil, because people who say sustainable palm oil don't understand what the word means. It can be less destructive, and that's probably a good thing. Let's say we go for banning palm oil or stopping, palm oil. Now, how many orangutans, how many trees you would save? Probably, I would estimate about 0. The reason being is you're not understanding the situation. Let's say I'm a businessman, right? And I want to make some money. There's a bunch of trees over there in the forest. I will fund a politician, doesn't make sense, for his campaign. He wins, and my reward is he'll give me access to the forest. And studies have shown, for example, in Indonesia, deforestation goes with the election cycle. And this is not unique to Indonesia. You can see this in Australia as another example. The same thing happens. So please don't think I'm singling out Indonesian or Indonesian politicians as unique. This happens, all around the world. And then I'll destroy the trees. Average concession, I'll make $1 million. Good. Then some of them just walk away, the cowboys. Others would go, look, I'm a businessman. Now, what crop should I plant on it to make maximum short-term profit for myself? I'm not worried about the future. I don't live here. I've bought my house on the Gold Coast already. So I'll plant palm oil. It's a pretty good investment. After 3 years, I'm going to make $1 million a year off this, off the average concession. However, if you ban palm oil, he's not going to say, oh, I'm not going to invest in any business on that land. He's going to go, I'm going to plant sugar palm. I'm going to plant rubber. I'm going to plant pulp paper. They're all equally profitable monocultures that can replace on that land. And so you could ban all the palm oil, doesn't make sense, but you're not addressing, doesn't make sense. The driver is greed, short-term greed. And unless you're denying him all opportunities of short-term greed from exploiting that environment, he'll continue to do that. And so, again, this is why I call it the two wings of the bird. We need the compassion and love to care to make a change. But we have to intelligently apply that, because indiscriminate charity causes more problems than the world creates. So we can have thousands of wonderful people going on a ban palm oil campaign and going palm oil free, which is not a bad thing, doesn't make sense. Making businesses less destructive doesn't make sense, and and having personal integrity about how you live your life is a wonderful thing. But if you believe you're actually going to affect meaningful change in the world, beyond that, that's not going to really be the case. You have to collectivise, and you have to collectivise in a way that can intelligently address the issue at hand.
Yeah. And another kind of interesting thing with palm oil is that it's a very efficient and productive crop. So like when you compare it to other crops that produce oil, it's 6 to 10 times more efficient. So if we assume that we will all use oil, we need oil on this planet, in a lot of ways, if we can manage these plantations effectively, it makes more sense to have palm oil than some other alternatives, just based on the fact that it is a more efficient crop. Or am I missing something there?
Now, why palm oil is so prized and it's such a good product to invest in is because, as you're saying, it's very efficient. For the same area, you can get a lot more product, does it make sense? Because the nature of the palm tree. But that same thing makes it that it's 5 to 6 times more productive. The same thing that makes it 5 to 6 times less sustainable, because it's going to just the nutrients and the micronutrients come from somewhere. It comes from the soil. And if you keep extracting that out, you're going to deplete the soil eventually, and that's why it collapses. And if you extract it more efficiently and more quicker, you'll destroy the soil more quickly. And that's why we're working in rainforest communities now and actually delivering products to market where you can actually make just as much money per hectare per year from an intact rainforest that's totally recycled and the soil is totally rejuvenated. And so you don't have to, doesn't make sense, you don't have to destroy the environment for a good economy. Now, what we discovered, because we, with this process, because we have to manage the budgets and the strategy for it, we can actually have models that extract more money per hectare per year from the rainforest using things like jungle honey, rattan, bamboo, a diverse economy. But these diverse, doesn't make sense, sustainable economies from the ecosystem, they naturally favor that most of the money, let's say 80% of the money, goes to the local community. The exploitative monocultures, 80% of the money gets extracted outside to the billionaires outside of Indonesia in this example. And so that's the issue is, we can be sustainable and we can have viable, beautiful, to make sense, sustainable economies. But the unfortunate trade-off for the greedy few is most of the money goes to everyone else. Doesn't make sense? The majority of people get richer, doesn't make sense? And they haven't got the ability to get rich quick. And that's what they're really fighting to hold, not that they're fighting to keep the economy going or for jobs, which is, you see here in Australia, we're going to destroy the planet through coal mining or logging old growth forest because we need jobs. It's not true. Does that make sense? They need to retain a model where the majority of funds enrich the already wealthy. Does that make sense? But we can have actually better economies. Doesn't take more money, yeah. But unfortunately, for the uber wealthy, it will naturally be spread much more evenly over the community.
Yeah, the point that you made about it being an efficient crop doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing for the planet. Like, it's efficient at producing this oil, but it's also efficient at kind of damaging the environment that it's on. That's something that I haven't really taken that angle before, but it makes perfect sense.
And a lot of one big trouble with palm oil plantations, not only obviously destruction, is all the villages lose all the water. They have droughts because they're so thirsty, and they have to import water now. They can't. The wells dry up because of the palm oil, and because the rainforest is like this big sponge. So if you ever go in the rainforest, like 30 years ago, the water flowed all year round. So when it rained, the sponge created and some came out. And when it was drought, the sponge kept on releasing it. So you had this very regular water supply. Now the villages have droughts, no water, and then they have a flood when it rains and wipes out the village, And so, as well as obviously causing massive global warming to put a palm oil plantation, you destroy the local economy around it. The infrastructure that is required, doesn't make sense, the sound environment which is required for the local people to prosper.
Yeah. Okay. From a consumer perspective, though, I think a lot of people at the moment, they're trying to be more conscious with the products that they buy in the supermarket. But you have these different camps of what they should be doing, aka no palm oil, sustainable palm oil, or palm oil. What advice do you give to them, like from a practical, something that people can do on an everyday basis?
I think that the number we know, holistically, that the number one thing we can do as a consumer is become a vegan, to help the planet. That's just the way it is, whether you like meat or not. It's just the number one thing is. But it also links back to love and compassion. Does that make sense? It's a lack of compassion for the billions of animals which we slaughter every year for the pleasure of the taste, and that's about 1/3 of global warming. There, doesn't make sense. By having the compassion in you that you can't bear killing and eating animal for your pleasure when it's wholly unnecessary. Then it extends out and you start saving the planet. So does that make sense? Through compassion and love, through ourselves, and then how we express it, will naturally, as we're discussing, have far-reaching effects. Does that make sense? On the planet, far beyond if we don't consider love and compassion for living beings within that equation.
So again, going back to identify what the root of the problem is, and then apply the appropriate medicine, which in this case is, compassion, love, and empathy, and all these kinds of things, all these values. There is a quote by Richard Dawkins that reads, and I'm fascinated by this quote, "We admit that we are like apes, but we seldom realize that we are apes." So this to me suggests an inconsistency in how we perceive our orange cousins, our orangutans, but also animals in general. So do you think that this psychological disconnect is like a fundamental barrier to achieve conservation at scale?
It certainly is. But the good news is we're seeing a slow expansion of empathy and inclusion over the years. An example I give is the American Declaration of Independence. And the people who wrote that were, smart, educated, moral giants for their time. They were some pretty, good guys, pretty smart guys. And they wrote in it, it's self-evident that all men are created equal. Self-evident meant they didn't have to explain it. It's just the way things is. But those same people kept slaves. And as more telling is those same people, they didn't see the persons who shared their beds and raised their children as being equal, because women didn't get the right to vote in America to the 1920s. So does it make sense?
Yeah,
so
100%.
They had a equality and compassion, doesn't make sense, but they had this block. They couldn't expand it beyond their skin color and beyond their sex. Doesn't make sense. And that doesn't mean that they weren't good people. Doesn't make sense. People destroying the planet, not necessarily bad people, but they just have this narrow viewpoint of inclusion, which doesn't allow them to go beyond that. And we're seeing that breaking down, hopefully, with, let's say, orangutans, and a lot of times I take people in the rainforest on my eco tours, and they have this wonderful, unique experience, and they see the humanity, and in fact, a more noble form of humanity in the eyes of an orangutan. And suddenly, does it make sense? The circle of inclusion and personhood reaches beyond our species, to orangutans, as an example. And that's no more profound than now, where we would think it's absolutely absurd to think somebody, just because they have black skin, we're like them, but not the same as them. We would think those are the absurd. And in the future, we will think the same thing absurd when we look at other persons who share a planet, such as orangutans, chimpanzees, and elephants. Our job at the moment, while the evolution is occurring, is to make sure we save enough intact ecosystems and populations. Does it make sense? That they're at least around
when that change occurs.
Yes.
Perfect sense. Yeah, this morality is on a continuum. So things that were considered moral 150 years ago, for example, slavery, is obviously now considered immoral today. And I always ask myself the question, what do we consider moral today that in 150 years' time will be considered immoral? And the thing that you talked about with veganism, I think that is exactly what's going to happen. Animal rights, it will be the thing that falls into that category, in my opinion. In 150 years' time, we're going to look back at today and we won't believe the things, how we're treating the animals that we are currently treating them, how we're treating them. I think that's what will happen.
Right. Yeah. And I think I'm probably quoting Martin Luther King badly, but he says that the curve to justice is a long curve, but it does make sense. It does point upwards, And I think, and the challenge for us is to save the planet, in the next 10 years, in order to naturally allow that curve, does it make sense? Time to keep pointing upwards.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. But if we can foresee that as being a goal, hopefully that can inspire us and motivate us, because we can see something positive at the end. Because I think eventually we will, as humankind, come to these conclusions that, we're doing something wrong, like we can do things better. We should be treating our fellow non-human animals and other life forms with respect. And so, the challenge, I guess, is conserving as many of these life forms so that they can benefit from this change in mentality from us humans down the track.
And I don't want to destroy hope, because I think there is reason for hope. However, I would prefer that we didn't have hope. Hope always comes with this constant companion despair, and it's not a good strategy for long-term marathon hurdles.
Interesting.
You'll end up with despair. And so, the saying I say is, I have no fear because I have no hope, And so, sure, we have a plan and a strategy which we believe is ultimately able to be successful, However, we do it, doesn't make sense, as a natural expression of love. So it's a bit like being if you're you're a fan of a football team, doesn't make sense, and you give up if it's on a losing streak. Well, you're not much of a fan, doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You got to say as your football team, you say, look, regardless we haven't won for a couple of years now, I'm sticking with you because I'm my personal self is so invested, doesn't make sense, in that team. I don't care if you keep losing. I'm going to keep turning up to the matches and supporting the team, and eventually that team will win. If you're fly-by-night, fan, you'll start changing teams halfway. In our case, you probably start owning a palm oil plantation. But so we have to. Does that make sense? So this is why, again, I reflect back to have to reform ourselves as individuals. And so the reason to why I keep going when things are tough, because I have to. That's just the way it is. I have to keep expressing that love in an intelligent way. So I'm not against hope, but I think we've got to be very careful that in the end, in the cycle, doesn't undermine what we're trying to achieve.
Well, I guess, again, back to the balance, we need to balance that with other things as well. Like, we can't be acting based on 100% hope. Like, I have a similar mentality with expectation, or at least expectation from things that are out of my control, because expectation from others, if you predicate your worth or these other things on things that are out of your control, then you're doomed at some point. Like, they'll reach a point where, I have a similar mentality with expectation, with hope, but with these things, you need to balance it with, optimism, but practicality, realism, and a whole other range of ingredients as well to come up with a recipe that's successful, not only in the short term, but the long term.
Never allow your happiness to be dictated by another. Never allow your present happiness to be predicated on future achievements. Those are the kind of the traps, I guess. Doesn't make sense? Which destroys the individuals.
Yeah. But the podcast is kind of going a bit longer, but there's still a couple of questions. Do you mind if you've got a bit of time to? Perfect. So, previous question, we were kind of touching on, I guess, the similarities that we have with the great apes and orangutans. But within that great ape family, what are some of the characteristics that distinguish orangutans from the rest of us, or from the rest of the great ape family?
The most striking thing I've found is they're a more noble form of person. Okay. Ourselves and our close ancestor, the chimpanzees, were capable of love and compassion, but were capable of such atrocities, murder, violence, warfare. And horrors beyond imagination. And so orangutans don't seem to have that. They don't seem to have that ability to look at another person and want to destroy them that chimpanzees and us have the capacity of doing. And this is why, although, let's say, an orangutan is about 7 times stronger than a human being, and the big males have canines the same size of a tiger, although we killed millions of them in the most horrific way possible, burning them alive, macheting them, shooting their eyes out with pellets, there's not one recorded history, not one zoo, one sanctuary in the wild that orangutan ever killing a human being. You know, they don't have that off switch that they can just look at another person, you know, and just say, you have no value, and I just want to destroy you and make you hurt. And so in a way, you know, I've spent a wonderful life. In part, I've got to spend a lot of it with these more noble forms of persons, you know, we share our planet.
Okay. And the intelligence part, in your book, you mentioned that orangutan intelligence, like for me, I just naturally assumed that, I guess, chimpanzees were behind humans, were the second most intelligent species. And I guess that's based on this arrogant point of view that because they share more DNA with us, that they are therefore more intelligent. But you're saying that orangutans are the second. What's your rationale for that?
Yeah. Well, a scientist called Carl van Schaick went through all the intelligence tests of all monkeys and apes. And no surprise to anybody who's worked with all the great apes and most of the monkeys, like myself, orangutans on the top. And the analogy I use is, you know, for the great apes, if you give a screwdriver to a gorilla, it'll scratch himself with it. I won't tell you what a bonobo, those hippies of the great apes do with it.
Those who are listening to that podcast know what you're talking about.
So, we'll throw the screwdriver at another chimpanzee. You give it to an orangutan and it'll escape. And so that's really it. And the most wonderful thing when you get to work with orangutans is we have a very high developed prefrontal cortex here, which is basically a computer simulator. We simulate the future, does it make sense? And with different scenarios. So a chimpanzee is like me with a video recorder. You know, they keep on trial and error until the damn thing works, you know?
Yeah.
But an orangutan is a bit more like my wife. He'll just sit there and review everything and press one button once and it'll work.
Yeah.
And so you often see the orangutans and they look unintelligent and lethargic, but their prefrontal cortex is running this computer simulation. So they'll just sit there for a long time and suddenly they just escape. Or they'll go get something, doesn't make sense, hidden somewhere. Because what they do is they think a lot and act once. And so, but remember, an orangutan may be a dunce in the classroom, but the genius in the rainforest. Intelligence is not, doesn't make sense. It's always applied to the environment that you've
definitely
in. So you can take an orangutan and put it in a zoo. It becomes an ugly caricature of a real orangutan. Does that make sense? Or you put it in a lab and you test it and go, well, it's pretty dumb, isn't it? Right? But you know, it's a bit like you know, if you live in a ghetto, right? What we know from looking at studies of intelligence of, let's say, kids in ghettos, they're geniuses. They're geniuses surviving in the ghetto. You put a rich kid from an ivory school and they'll die within days. You know, they just don't have the intelligence to survive. But conversely, if you put that same kid in university, he's going to fail. You know, because not only there's innate intelligences within each of us in each species, that intelligence naturally develops. For example, orangutans like us adapt to the environment through culture. So not natural instinct, like, let's say, lower animals such as
learned behaviour.
Yeah, exactly. And so it not only they learn the culture, but the brain develops, does that make sense? It develops the intelligence, yeah, which is required to survive in that unique environment. Yeah? And so you can't, you know, a kid that lives in the ghetto, you can't understand his intelligence outside of his environment, which he has culturally adapted to. And equally, you
Makes
can't
sense.
understand the intelligence of orangutan outside the environment they're uniquely adapted to. And that then gives us this very jaundiced view, and in some cases, a sense of superiority of humans, which is totally unfounded.
Yeah, it's almost so their intelligence. This again raises an issue of a lot of things. Is we have a measurement problem, intelligence, and also things like the success of a society. We currently measure the success on a society or a nation based on GDP, but GDP doesn't factor in other things like kind of happiness of the people and stuff like that. So that intelligence, we're measuring the intelligence of the orangutan based upon the test that we give it. But it seems as though their intelligence is very much predicated. It's like a niche intelligence that is very fine-tuned to their environment that they're in that moment. And another thing, yeah, so you go.
Yeah, and we see that all the time. We know in many tests, such as social intelligence and remembering high sequences of numbers, chimpanzees outperform humans consistently. Equally is with orangutans, their temporal spatial map, their ability to know where everything in the forest over space and time over multiple years, does that make sense, far exceeds any human being. So they would be in a forest living with humans and going, well, why don't you know every 5 years at this time that tree fruits? It's so easy to remember, they look at us as dunces, because they have this highly evolved spatial temporal memory, which is one of the most important things they need to survive. We, on the other hand, we survive very well by a tribe. Does that make sense? And this is why, for example, our need to connect and believe with a tribal narrative outweighs the facts. Does that make sense? Because our tribal unity has been so important to our survival. It's better for you to believe the rubbish that the leader and the tribe believe in than you to be right.
Yes.
Being right is less of a good survival strategy than you connecting with the tribe. Equally, as a tribal leader, he needs to make sure that you believe the narrative of the tribe. Someone who doesn't is got to be destroyed, even though they're right, because they're affecting the structure and the integrity of the tribe. This is why whistleblowers, even today, they're exposing corruption and illegal behavior in the best interest of the people, and they persecute them. They persecute them in secret courts and that sort of stuff. And the people in charge have a vitriol for them, because they're affecting, it's a tribal thing, they're affecting the survival of the tribe.
Yeah.
However, those kind of tribal instincts, doesn't make sense, are not productive, doesn't make sense, for a open, large, democratic society anymore. And without evolving, doesn't make sense, without leaders with some sort of spiritual evolvement beyond, doesn't make sense, our tribal instincts, we're doomed to a tribal mentality which is now dysfunctional. So you take an orangutan out of the rainforest, it becomes dysfunctional. You take a kid out of the ghetto, it becomes dysfunctional, right? We've got a tribal species, doesn't make sense, with our leaders and our people acting in the tribal nature, but we're out of the tribal environment, and therefore we become dysfunctional. And the expression of the dysfunction is with destroying the environment which supports us. And so we have to evolve. Does that make sense? We have to evolve to adapt to the new environment, and unfortunately, there's some powerful dinosaurs who are trying to hold back that evolution that we need.
Unfortunately, yeah, these rich, powerful dinosaurs that have a lot of influence over people in positions of power. But yeah, hopefully this evolution reaches a point where, I guess we can tip the scales in the other direction. So you were a zookeeper. I think in the 1980s, you started working at the Perth Zoo, and you worked there for a number of years, but now you're no longer in the zoo. So this question is probably quite a good one for you. From a conservation and animal rights perspective, what is your stance on zoos today, and how do you hope they evolve in the future?
Yeah. certainly for like persons such as elephants and orangutans, all the great apes, zoos are not places where they can survive. They can't survive genetically because all the population is unsustainable. So there's no conservation value, and there's a huge welfare problem with keeping persons in captivity. No matter how well you look after, you can keep persons in refugee camps and look after them very well, but we know psychologically they get destroyed because persons need to be able to, live in their own societies, control their future and control who and when they associate with in order to function happily, doesn't make sense, and successfully and have mental health. Zoos are not an appropriate place for those.
Okay, so
Am I against all zoos? I mean, the example all possibilities for zoos. I mean, the example I give, if I was giraffe, right, and living in an open range zoo, in my herd, getting fed all the time, getting first class veterinary care, and I'm not very bright. Just as long as I got my herd and my food doesn't make sense, and I'm not sick, I'm going to be pretty damn happy, And you said to me, look, I've got this idea. I'm going to take you back to African savannah where you have to go and survive in a Serengeti, and there's going to be hyenas hunting you at night and that sort of stuff. I'll probably go, look, that kind of stuff is not really for me. I'll stay in my zoo. So again, it's one of those, extremes are never the answer to anything.
Definitely.
Are zoos at the moment good? Predominantly, no. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Is there a future where some animals which do well, and are happy in zoos in the appropriate enclosures and environment can't share our cities? Doesn't make sense, and we can as children and say connect with them, and get a wonderful experience. Yes, both are possible, but zoos have to evolve. Doesn't make sense. The CEOs believe, oh my God, my zoo will collapse if we don't have elephants. The zoo will collapse unless I have these postage stamp collections of animals. But there's great places, doesn't make sense, where you can go see animals, doesn't make sense, who are living in a natural ecosystem, natural environment, doesn't make sense, and prospering both mentally and physically. And the interaction with the people is totally appropriate, doesn't make sense. But they have to kind of, unfortunately, make that, the evolutionary leap. Doesn't make sense.
Yes.
And what happens is two things: is I could have had my sense of self-worth as a zookeeper. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. And then I would spend all my life defending. Doesn't make sense. Zookeeping, and zoos. Doesn't make sense, because if you attack that, who am I? I must be a bad person. Doesn't make sense.
Yes.
And my life. But if you have that evolution, doesn't make sense, two things happen. Is you can say, actually, no, some of the things I've done in the past aren't necessarily great. I've learned, doesn't make sense. I've learned from my experience and gone beyond it. And that's why we should really never criticize people for what they did in the past, doesn't make sense. Because you hold them back in defending, doesn't make sense, a behavior that they will naturally grow out of, you know what I mean? And as their understanding and love and compassion grows, those things will naturally fall off. And that's part of the evolution. So even in conservation, you may have conservation who started on a particular vein and then get to the conclusion, oh my God, that's probably not very effective. But if they're invested in that, does it make sense? They'll stay there long beyond its capacity to really do good. Similarly, the Industrial Revolution has created plenty of opportunities, and made the world a better place. But you have people invested in, the power sources and the power structures which allow the evolution, doesn't make sense. And their sense of self-worth and power is linked to that. And they haven't got the ability, doesn't make sense,
Yeah.
The young entrepreneurs, you see them, they're going, I'm not invested in that. I can see the future. I can see a better way, doesn't make sense. And so this is why, as individuals, I always fall short of criticizing them, doesn't make sense. If you keep criticizing them, they become more entrenched, doesn't make sense, holding on old paradigm from which their egos are set. You got to allow them the freedom and provide the love, even to the people, doesn't make sense, you disagree with, to allow them to move beyond it.
Yeah. And I'd even go, like, so you said that, that you don't criticize people on their past. Like, I'd also say, like, we shouldn't really be criticizing people on what they do now, the focus should be communicating with these people to figure out how we could progress from there. Because there's ways to criticize people, but most people don't really respond quite well to it, to be honest. So, if your objective is to progress and to, evolve to a place that is better than what it is currently, we need to approach it from probably a more empathetic and compassionate angle.
Yeah. If you can understand, if you were born with the same brain in the same environment as the person you're in conflict with, you would be acting the same way.
Yep.
And
I believe in that.
Where's the arrogance of you being better doesn't make sense, and looking down at them doesn't make sense. And if they're acting inappropriately and they're acting with malice, they're acting from a place of hurt, from within themselves. Happy people cannot hurt people. You can't have a happy terrorist. You can't conceive of hurting others if you're happy, And so our attitude for them is, one, a lack of arrogance of superiority.
Yeah.
And two, compassion. That person's hurting, and attacking a hurting person doesn't make sense. It's like if a dog's in the street, he's been run over by a car, and you try to hurt it and starting to bite you, then the appropriate response is not to kick the dog because it's trying to bite you. The appropriate response is to understand that dog is in pain, doesn't make sense, and do whatever you can within the safety, doesn't make sense, within the safety not getting bitten, to help that poor creature.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. And people destroying the planet and doesn't make sense and hate others are exactly the same as that poor dog in the street.
Yeah, I believe in that. Okay, so we're nearing the end. How can people connect with you and learn more about the work that you do?
Well, we have projects for the orangutans, elephants, and tigers, and you can connect with all of those. But if you go to the Orangutan Project.org on the website, you can connect with us and see how you can help, how you can join a collectivization to make meaningful changes in the world. And of course, I do eco tours into the wild, and I regularly go to cities in Australia, New York, and London doing tours, and talks and books, and you can buy my books. And therefore, and connect that way, to join, does make sense, and join collectively in a way that will make a meaningful change in the world. And that way empowers all of us, no matter what our skills are. Whether our skills is that we have a little bit of spare money that we can contribute, or become a volunteer, does that make sense, or work in the field, that all those unique abilities and capacity all can join into making a meaningful change, not only for the orangutans, but for the whole planet.
Yeah. And I'll put all this information down below. And just to throw it out there, I'm currently, so you're Finding Our Humanity, which you published last year. I'm currently in the process of reading that, and I find it very interesting because it takes on a very kind of philosophical angle, which is something that I really enjoy. I kind of really enjoy diving deep into these ideas. So I highly recommend that one. So for the final part, what message or question do you want to leave the conservation tribe?
The message is, from my point of view, collectivise with a good organisation in according to your capacity and assets to make a meaningful change, and start a journey, in a sense, within yourself to find that love and compassion within you, and that's a wonderful thing. If you find that, you become joyous and happy. Does that make sense? And then you will make the world happy and become more effective. Does that make sense? In making the world more happy.
Yeah. So beginning with the simple idea of changing yourself, and then beautiful complexity can arise from that. Love that.